Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a classic, a book that really shook things up when it came out, The Selfish Gene by Richard
Oh,
Dawkins.
yeah, that's a big one.
It is. It really gets into some fundamental questions about, why are we here? What's the point of life? Even if our good deeds are actually all that selfless.
Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, those are certainly key questions, and I think that's why this book still resonates with people today.
Yeah, and it's not exactly light reading, but it really makes you think differently about the world around us.
Dawkins has a way of explaining complex ideas in a way that really grabs you, even if you don't have a background in biology.
Right, he uses these really vivid analogies and thought experiments that kind of stick with you.
Like that whole thing about genes being like little alien programmers sending instructions from Andromeda.
Yeah, that one blew my mind when I first read it. But before we get too deep into the specifics, maybe we should just start with a basic overview for any listeners who haven't read the book yet.
Sure, so at its core, the selfish gene is about reframing how we think about evolution.
So it's not just about survival of the fittest, like the strongest lion or the fastest cheetah.
Right, it goes deeper than that.
So what is it about then?
Dawkins argues that the real driving force of evolution isn't the individual organism or even the species.
Okay, so not the lion, not the pride of lions.
It's the gene. He says genes are the fundamental unit of selection.
Genes, huh? Interesting. I've always heard of DNA and things like that, but never really stopped to think about what a gene really is.
Yeah, and that's where Dawkins starts too. He defines a gene as the basic unit of heredity, the thing that gets passed down from generation to generation.
So all those traits we inherit from our parents, that's all encoded in our genes.
Exactly. And those genes, they have one primary goal to replicate themselves.
So it's not about the survival of the fittest lion, it's about the survival of the fittest gene.
Exactly. Genes are these tiny little replicators, and they're constantly competing with each other to get passed on to the next generation.
So our bodies are just vehicles for these genes.
That's exactly how Dawkins puts it. He calls us survival machines.
Survival machines, huh? So we're just like cars and the genes are driving.
Well, in a way, yes, our bodies are the vessels that genes use to navigate the world and ultimately make more copies of themselves.
That's kind of a humbling thought, isn't it?
It is, but it also explains a lot about why we are the way we are.
So how does this whole selfish gene idea explain things like altruism?
Right, because if genes are so selfish, shouldn't they make us selfish too?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
This is where things get really interesting. Dawkins argues that altruism, especially towards family, can actually be explained through the lens of gene survival.
Okay, so how does that work?
Think about it. Your genes aren't just in you, they're also in your relatives.
Oh, right. We share genes with our siblings, our parents, cousins.
Exactly. So if you do something to help your family, even if it puts you at risk, you're indirectly helping those shared genes survive.
I see. So it's like I'm helping my genes by helping my brother, even if I don't directly benefit.
Precisely. Dawkins uses the work of W.D. Hamilton to explain this. He came up with something called Hamilton's rule.
Hamilton's rule.
Yeah, it basically says that altruism is more likely to evolve when the benefit to the recipient multiplied by their degree of relatedness to you outweighs the cost to you.
So the closer you are to someone genetically, the more likely you are to help them out, even if it costs you something.
Exactly. It's like a biological cost-benefit analysis for being nice.
So even though the genes themselves are selfish, they can lead to seemingly selfless behavior on the part of the organism.
Right. It's all about maximizing the chances of those genes getting passed on to the next generation.
This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about evolution.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Dawkins goes on to explore all sorts of fascinating implications of the selfish gene idea.
Okay, so we've got selfish genes using us as survival machines, sometimes leading to altruism. But I know Dawkins also talks about some less cooperative aspects of biology too, right?
Yeah, he dives into the battle of the sexes, for example.
Ooh, yeah, I was wondering about that. Everyone always wants to know about the evolutionary basis for the differences between men and women.
Right, and Dawkins argues that a lot of those differences stem from something as basic as the difference between sperm and eggs.
And eggs, okay, I'm listening.
It all boils down to investment.
Mm.
Sperm are tiny and plentiful, while eggs are much larger and packed with resources.
Ah, so females are putting a lot more energy into each offspring from the get-go.
Exactly. And that leads to different strategies when it comes to mating.
So how does that play out?
Well, females become choosier. They look for partners with good genes or who will help raise the kids, while males, with their abundance of sperm, can potentially father a lot of offspring with different females.
So that creates competition among the males.
Exactly. Competition for access to those choosy females. And that competition drives the evolution of all sorts of elaborate courtship displays and mating rituals.
So everything from peacock feathers to, those crazy mating dances birds do, it's all driven by this basic difference in gametes.
It's amazing how much complexity arises from that initial difference.
Yeah, it's like that one tiny difference sets off this whole chain reaction of behaviors.
Right. Dawkins calls the different strategies that species use to navigate this whole reproductive mating markets.
Mating markets, huh? It sounds kind of cold and calculating.
Well, it's not about conscious calculation, of course. It's just the way natural selection has shaped behavior over millions of years.
Okay, so we've got selfish genes creating us as their survival machines, sometimes leading to altruism, but also this inherent difference between the sexes that drives competition. But if we're all driven by these selfish genes, how does cooperation ever evolve? Wouldn't everyone just backstab each other all the time?
That's a great question, and it's something that puzzled scientists for a long time. It's like, how do you get a bunch of inherently selfish individuals to work together?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too.
Dawkins tackles this head-on by bringing in the concept of game theory.
Game theory? Like what, poker and chess?
Well, it's broader than that. It's essentially a way to analyze strategic decision-making in situations where individuals are competing with each other.
Okay, so how does that apply to evolution?
Dawkins uses a classic example called the prisoner's dilemma. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I think so. Isn't it about two criminals who have to decide whether to betray each other or stay silent?
Exactly. And it perfectly illustrates the conflict between acting in your own self-interest and cooperating.
Okay, remind me how it goes.
So you've got these two prisoners who are being interrogated separately, and they each have two choices. They can either betray the other by confessing, or they can stay silent.
And depending on what they both choose, they get different sentences.
Right. If they both stay silent, they both get a relatively light sentence.
Yeah.
But if one betrays the other while the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free, while the silent one gets a really harsh sentence.
Oh, so there's a strong incentive to betray.
And if they both betray each other, they both get a moderate sentence.
So that's the dilemma.
The dilemma is that from each individual's perspective, the best strategy is to always betray the other, no matter what the other one does.
But if they both betray each other, they both end up worse off than if they had both cooperated.
Exactly. And that's the crux of the prisoner's dilemma. It shows how rational self-interest can sometimes lead to a suboptimal outcome for everyone.
So how does this relate to the evolution of cooperation?
Well, it seems like in a world of selfish genes, betrayal should always be the winning strategy.
Yeah, it's like every man for himself.
But Dawkins shows how cooperation can actually emerge and become stable over time.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear how that works.
He introduces the idea of an evolutionarily stable strategy, or ESS.
ESS.
Yeah, it's basically a strategy that, once it's adopted by a majority of individuals, can't be beaten by any other strategy.
So it's like the ultimate winning formula for social interactions.
In a way, yes.
So what kind of strategy could actually beat out betrayal in the prisoner's dilemma?
Well, one surprisingly simple but effective strategy is called tit for tat.
Tit for tat, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's basically you start by cooperating.
Yeah.
And then you just do whatever your opponent did in the previous round.
So if they cooperate, you cooperate back. If they betray you, you betray them next time.
Exactly. It's like saying, I'm willing to be nice, but I'm not going to let you take advantage of me.
Does that really work?
What's fascinating is that over many repeated interactions, tit for tat often outperforms more aggressive strategies.
Really? Why is that?
Well, it encourages cooperation, but it also punishes cheating, which makes it hard for those less cooperative strategies to spread.
So even in a world of selfish genes, being nice can actually be a winning strategy.
And that's just one example. Dawkins goes on to explore all sorts of other ways that cooperation can evolve, even in a world driven by individual self-interest.
So maybe we're not all doomed to betray each other after all.
No, I think there's hope for us yet.
But wait, Dawkins doesn't stop there, right? He takes this whole replicator concept even further.
He does. And this is where things get even more interesting.
Okay, hit me with it.
He introduces the concept of memes, those units of cultural information that spread from person to person.
Wait, memes? Like those funny pictures and videos online.
Well, yeah, those are definitely a type of meme. But the idea is broader than that.
Okay, so what else counts as a meme?
It could be an idea, a tune, a fashion, a ritual, basically any piece of culture that can be copied and transmitted.
Ah, I see. So it's like how we learn and share things with each other.
Exactly. And just like genes, Dawkins argues that memes can evolve.
They evolve, so they change over time.
Right. They exhibit longevity. Some memes stick around for a long time.
Like centuries even.
Exactly. They also exhibit fecundity. They can be copied rapidly, sometimes going viral.
Ah, like those catchy jingles you can't get out of your head.
Precisely. And they also exhibit copying infidelity, which means they can be copied with varying degrees of accuracy.
So sometimes they change a little bit as they spread.
Right. And just like with genes, the most successful memes, the ones that are best at replicating and surviving, are the ones that become most common in a culture.
So it's like there's this whole invisible world of cultural evolution happening all around us.
Exactly. It's happening in our conversations, in our media, even in our art and music.
This is making my head spin a little. So you're saying that just like our bodies are vehicles for genes, our minds are vehicles for memes.
In a way, yes.
Hmm.
Our minds are the environments where memes replicate and compete.
Wow. So are memes like parasitic? Are they using us?
Well, Dawkins uses the word selfish to describe them, just like he does with genes. It's not that they're consciously trying to manipulate us, it's just that their very nature is to spread and replicate.
Okay, but doesn't that mean they can sometimes spread even if they're not good for us?
That's right. Just like genes can sometimes have negative consequences, memes can too.
So like a meme for smoking, even though it's harmful, it still managed to spread for a long time.
Exactly. Or think about how quickly misinformation can spread online. It's like a virus.
Okay, this is kind of freaking me out. If our genes are pulling the strings in one way and these selfish memes are influencing us in another, how much control do we really have?
That's a question Dawkins leaves us pondering. And that's what makes this book so fascinating. It challenges our assumptions about who we are and why we do the things we do.
It's like the more we learn about evolution, the less clear the answers become.
But isn't that the beauty of science? It keeps us asking questions and exploring new possibilities.
Absolutely, and the selfish gene definitely opens up a whole new world of possibilities to explore.
And we're just getting started.
This has been incredible so far, and we've barely scratched the surface of what Dawkins has to offer, so stay tuned. We'll be right back to dive even deeper into the implications of this groundbreaking book.
Yeah, there's a lot more to uncover.
Okay, so much to unpack here. I'm still processing all that stuff about memes.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, maybe we should circle back to some of the other big ideas in The Selfish Gene.
Sure. What did you have in mind?
Well, one thing that really struck me was how Dawkins challenges this idea that natural selection works for the good of the species.
Right, like the idea that animals restrain themselves from overhunting or overbreeding so their species doesn't die out.
Yeah, exactly. I always thought that sounded a bit too simplistic, like nature's just trying to be all balanced and harmonious.
Dawkins definitely pokes some holes in that idea.
So how does he debunk it?
Well, he uses this great analogy about lions.
Lions. Okay.
So if group selection were real, shouldn't lions show restraint and only hunt birds or reptiles, for the good of all mammals?
Oh, I see, because if they overhunt their prey, they could wipe out their own food source.
Exactly, but of course that's not what happens. They go after the most readily available prey, even if it's other mammals.
Good point. They're not exactly known for their vegetarianism.
Right, so if it's not about the good of the species, what is it about?
Yeah, what's the real driving force, according to Dawkins?
He argues that natural selection really operates at the level of the gene.
The gene again, there it is.
It all comes back to those selfish genes. Remember, he even defines a gene as the largest entity which at least potentially possesses the properties of longevity, fecundity, and copying fidelity.
Longevity, fecundity, and copying fidelity. Those are some big words.
Basically, it means genes are good at surviving, they're good at making copies of themselves, and those copies are pretty accurate.
So genes are the ultimate survivors because they can last for generations, make more of themselves, and make sure those copies are pretty faithful to the original.
Exactly, and this leads to another mind-blowing concept.
Lay it on me.
Dawkins argues that organisms are essentially gene machines built to carry and propagate those genes.
Gene machines, huh? So we're like robots programmed by our genes.
Well, not exactly robots, but the idea is that our bodies are the vehicles that genes use to navigate the world and ultimately make more copies of themselves.
So our whole existence is just about serving our genes.
That's a pretty radical way to put it, but it's the core of Dawkins' argument.
This is really making me question everything. Like, if our bodies are gene machines, does that mean our brains are gene machines too?
That's exactly what Dawkins proposes.
Whoa.
To explain this relationship between genes and brains, he takes us back to that Andromeda analogy.
Andromeda again. Are we going on another interstellar trip?
This time, think about the challenge those Andromedans face in controlling their probes here on Earth.
Okay, I'm listening.
There's this huge time delay, so real-time communication is impossible.
Right, it would take years for a message to travel back and forth.
So they have to program those probes with a set of instructions to handle any situation they might encounter.
So they're trying to anticipate every possible scenario and write code for it. That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, and Dawkins says our genes face a similar problem. They can't directly control our every move in real time.
So what do they do?
They build brains, incredibly complex computers, and load them up with the rules and advice to deal with as many situations as they can anticipate.
So our brains are like super sophisticated computers programmed by our genes to help us survive.
That's the idea, of course, just like even the best programmer can't predict every possible move in a chess game. Genes can't foresee every challenge we'll face.
So they give us the basic framework, but our brains have to make decisions in the moment.
Exactly. It's not a perfect system, but it's worked pretty well so far.
It makes you wonder what the most advanced form of that programming would look like. Would our genes eventually just say, figure it out yourselves?
Dawkins actually suggests that the logical endpoint, though not yet reached by any species, would be for genes to give their survival machines one simple instruction. Do whatever you think best to keep us alive.
Wow, so that's like the ultimate expression of free will.
In a way, yes. It's fascinating to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
But even if our brains have some degree of autonomy, there's still this underlying tension between individual genes and the organism as a whole, right?
Absolutely, and that tension plays out in all sorts of interesting ways.
Like how?
Dawkins talks about the battle of the generations, for example.
The battle of the generations? What's that all about?
He argues that despite the shared genetic interests between parents and offspring, there's an inherent conflict.
Wait, a conflict? I thought parents were supposed to be all about nurturing and self-sacrifice for their kids.
They are, to a large extent. But remember, everything comes back to those genes maximizing their survival chances.
Right.
And sometimes the interests of parents and offspring clash when it comes to how much investment each child receives.
I see. So it's like parents want to spread their resources evenly among all their children, but each individual child wants to grab as much as possible for themselves.
Precisely. And this can lead to some pretty interesting power dynamics.
Like what?
Well, Dawkins gives the example of baby birds begging for food even if they're not that hungry.
Oh, yeah, they're always chirping away with their mouths wide open.
And they're essentially trying to trick their parents into giving them more than their fair share.
So those cute little chirps are actually a form of manipulation.
From a gene's eye view, you could see it that way. And parents, in turn, have evolved strategies to detect these little tricks.
So it's like an arms race between parents and offspring.
In a way, yes. It's a delicate balance. They don't want to be fooled, but they also don't want to risk neglecting a truly hungry chick.
It's like this complex game of strategy playing out between parents and kids, with everyone trying to maximize their genetic success.
Dawkins describes it as a kind of tug of war over parental investment.
It makes you wonder how much of our own behavior as parents and children is influenced by this ancient tug of war.
That's a fascinating question, and one that Dawkins doesn't fully explore in this book.
Right, he's focusing more on the broader evolutionary principles.
But it's definitely something to ponder.
It is. But speaking of conflict, one of the most fascinating parts of the book is the chapter on the battle of the sexes.
Ah, yes, the eternal dance of attraction, competition, and conflict between males and females.
We touched on it earlier, but there's so much more to unpack there.
Absolutely. Dawkins delves into the evolutionary roots of these differences, starting with that fundamental asymmetry in gametes.
Right, the sperm versus egg thing.
Exactly. Sperm are small and plentiful, while eggs are larger and much more resource-intensive.
And that sets the stage for the whole evolutionary drama.
It does. Because females invest so much more in each offspring, they tend to be choosier about their mates.
Makes sense. They're looking for the best possible genes and the best chance of survival for their offspring.
Right. And males, on the other hand, can potentially father many offspring with different females, so they often compete fiercely for access to those choosy females.
So all those elaborate courtship displays and mating rituals we see in nature, are they all just a consequence of that initial difference in gamete size?
In a way, yes. Dawkins explores a fascinating array of examples, from the extravagant plumage of peacocks to the fierce battles between elephant seals for dominance.
It's mind-blowing how much diversity there is in mating strategies across the animal kingdom.
It is. And it all boils down to this basic difference in reproductive investment.
It makes you wonder if humans are playing out some version of this battle as well.
Of course. We have our own unique set of courtship rituals and mating strategies, shaped by our evolutionary history.
I'd be curious to hear Dawkins' take on modern human mating dynamics.
He doesn't delve too deeply into human behavior in this book, but he does acknowledge that we're not exempt from the evolutionary forces that shape all life on Earth.
So even our most intimate relationships might be influenced by these ancient biological drives?
It's a thought-provoking idea, isn't it?
It is. But it's important to remember that Dawkins isn't saying we're slaves to our biology.
Right. He acknowledges the remarkable complexity of the human brain and our capacity for learning culture and even defying our instincts.
You're not just robots acting out pre-programmed scripts.
Exactly. But understanding those underlying biological drives can give us a deeper appreciation for the forces that shape our behavior, even those we might not be consciously aware of.
Okay, so we've talked about competition, conflict, and the battle of the sexes. But Dawkins also spends a good chunk of the book exploring cooperation.
That's right. And it might seem counterintuitive at first, given his emphasis on selfish genes.
It does seem like a bit of a paradox.
It is. But Dawkins shows how cooperation can actually evolve and be incredibly beneficial, even in a world driven by individual self-interest.
So how does he explain that?
Well, we touched on the tit-for-tat strategy earlier, which demonstrates how cooperation can emerge in competitive situations.
Right, that whole cooperate then reciprocate idea.
Exactly. But Dawkins goes further, exploring how cooperation can evolve in more complex settings, like within groups of animals.
So why would a bunch of selfish individuals choose to band together? Wouldn't it be better for each individual to just go it alone?
It might seem that way at first glance, but Dawkins points out that group living offers a number of advantages.
Like what?
One of the most important is protection from predators.
Ah, safety in numbers.
Exactly. He uses the idea of the selfish herd to illustrate this.
The selfish herd. What's that all about?
Imagine a school of fish. Each individual wants to avoid being on the edge of the school where it's most vulnerable to attack.
Makes sense.
So they'll bunch together, each individual using the others as a shield.
So it's like everyone's trying to minimize their own risk, but in doing so, they end up creating a safer environment for the whole group.
Precisely. It's safety in numbers, but with a selfish twist.
That's a pretty clever way to think about it.
And this selfish herd effect can explain why we see so many animals living in groups, from herds of wildebeest to flocks of birds.
But surely there must be some downsides to group living, right? Like competition for resources and mates.
Of course. Dawkins explores this trade-off between costs and benefits.
So what's the optimal strategy?
Well, it depends on the specific circumstances, like the availability of food, the level of predation, and so on.
So it's like a constant balancing act, weighing the benefits of protection against the potential for conflict within the group.
Exactly. And this balancing act has led to a remarkable diversity of group living strategies in nature.
Speaking of group living, Dawkins also delves into the fascinating world of social insects, like ants and bees.
Ah, yes, the ultimate cooperators.
They've really taken this whole group living thing to a whole new level.
They have. And this is where the selfish gene framework really shines.
How so?
Well, it provides a powerful explanation for how seemingly altruistic behaviors, like the self-sacrifice of worker bees, can evolve.
We talked earlier about how helping relatives can indirectly benefit shared genes, but the social structure of insect colonies takes this to an extreme.
It does. And Dawkins explains this through the concept of haplodiploidy.
Haplodiploid, okay, that one's going to need some explaining.
Sure, so haplodiploidy is a unique genetic system found in many social insects.
Okay, what's so unique about it?
In these insects, females develop from fertilized eggs, while males develop from unfertilized eggs.
So females have 2 sets of chromosomes, while males only have 1.
Exactly. And because of this system, sisters in a colony are more closely related to each other than they are to their own potential offspring.
Wait,
Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive, but the math works out that way.
so from a gene's eye view, it makes more sense for a female worker bee to help raise her sisters than to have her own children.
Precisely. Because those sisters share a larger proportion of her genes.
So the genetic structure of these insect colonies has basically flipped the script. Instead of selfish genes promoting individual reproduction, they're driving this extreme form of altruism and cooperation.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how the same underlying principle genes striving to replicate can lead to wildly different outcomes depending on the context.
It's mind-blowing to think about how these tiny genetic differences can have such profound effects on behavior.
It is. And it highlights the power of the selfish gene framework to explain a wide range of phenomena, from individual behavior to the complex social structures of entire colonies.
Okay, so we've gone from lions to fish to bees, all through the lens of selfish genes.
And we're not done yet. Remember those names we were talking about earlier?
Oh yeah, those cultural replicators.
Oh, Dawkins argues that memes, just like genes, exhibit longevity, fecundity, and copying fidelity.
So they can stick around for a long time, replicate rapidly, and be copied with varying degrees of accuracy.
Exactly. And he suggests that memes, like genes, can be selfish, competing for our attention and mind space.
So just like genes are battling it out in the gene pool, memes are fighting for survival in the meme pool of our culture.
Precisely. And just like with genes, some memes are more successful than others.
The ones that are best at grabbing our attention and getting us to spread them.
Exactly. And those memes shape our culture in profound ways.
This whole meme thing is making me rethink everything from viral videos to ancient religious texts.
It's a powerful way to look at how culture evolves and spreads.
But it's also a bit unsettling, isn't it? If our minds are just battlegrounds for these selfish memes, how much control do we really have over our own thoughts and beliefs?
That's a great question, and one that we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into the implications of the selfish gene.
Yeah, that's a question that's been bugging me too. Like, if these memes are so powerful, how much are we really in control of our own minds?
It's a big question, one that gets to the heart of what it means to be human, and Dawkins doesn't shy away from tackling it in The Selfish Gene.
So, how does he apply these ideas to us humans?
Well, he argues that humans are unique in our capacity for culture, but that culture itself is subject to the same evolutionary forces as the rest of the living world.
So, it's not just our genes that are evolving, our culture is too.
Right, and those memes, those units of cultural information, are the key players in that evolution. They're constantly competing with each other, replicating and spreading throughout our societies.
You know, when we were talking about this earlier, I couldn't help but think about how much I just blindly share things online sometimes, like without really thinking about whether it's true or not.
That's the great example of how memes can work. They can hijack our attention and get us to spread them, even if we're not consciously aware of what we're doing.
So is Dawkins saying that we're all just mindless puppets controlled by these memes?
Not exactly. He acknowledges the complexity of the human brain and our ability to reason and make choices.
Yeah.
But he also suggests that we might be more influenced by memes than we realize.
So it's like a tug of war between our conscious minds and these unconscious forces shaping our thoughts and beliefs.
In a way, yes. And Dawkins even goes so far as to suggest that some of our most deeply held cultural traditions, like religion, can be seen as particularly potent memes.
So is he saying that religion is just a mind virus or something?
He's definitely provocative, but he doesn't dismiss religion entirely. He acknowledges the role it plays in human societies, but he also highlights how it can spread through blind faith, sometimes leading to behaviors that might not be in our best interests.
I see. So it's not about saying that religion is good or bad. It's about understanding how it fits into this bigger picture of cultural evolution.
Exactly. It's about applying a scientific lens to understand how these beliefs and behaviors have evolved and persisted over time.
This whole discussion is really making me think differently about free will.
That's one of the big questions that the selfish gene raises. If our genes and our memes are both influencing our behavior, how much agency do we really have?
Yeah, like are we really in control of our own choices, or are we just playing out some script written by our genes and our culture?
It's a tough question, and one that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
And I don't think Dawkins claims to have all the answers.
No, but he encourages us to be open to the possibility that our actions might be more influenced by these underlying biological and cultural forces than we'd like to think.
So are we just sophisticated robots programmed by our genes and memes?
It's not quite that simple. Dawkins acknowledges the remarkable complexity of the human brain and its capacity for learning, reasoning, and creativity. He doesn't deny the existence of consciousness or free will, but he suggests that we might need to redefine what those concepts mean within an evolutionary context.
So maybe it's not a simple case of nature versus nurture, but rather this incredibly complex interplay between our genes, our culture, and our own individual experiences.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying human behavior so fascinating.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. We've gone from the origins of life to the evolution of culture, all through the lens of the selfish gene.
It's a book that really makes you think.
It does. So what are your final takeaways for our listeners who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all these big ideas?
Well, I think the main thing is that The Selfish Gene is a book that challenges us to see the world in a new light. It makes us question our assumptions about who we are and why we do the things we do, and that's never a bad thing.
I completely agree. It's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
And it's a book that's just as relevant today as it was when it was first published.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, if you're looking for a book that will make you think differently about the world around you, I highly recommend checking out The Selfish Gene.
You might not agree with everything Dawkins says,
Mm.
but I guarantee you'll come away with a deeper understanding of the forces that shape our lives and our world.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the selfish gene. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to exploring another fascinating topic with you soon.